Hello students, good afternoon to you all. Welcome to my YouTube channel Biology Tutorials. Today we will going to study the next part of chapter number 2 of class 12, that is fertilization in plants. In this video we will discuss about what all are the events that will take place during the process of fertilization in the flowering plants. So let's begin with. So what is fertilization? It is the process of fusion of the male and the female gametes, and this process was first discovered by Strasburger in 1884 in the Monotropa plants. So there are different events that takes place during the process of fertilization. What are they? First is the chemo attraction of pollen and pistil. After that, movement of the pollen grain through the style in the pollen tube. Next is the fertilization, and lastly the double fertilization. So we will discuss these steps one by one. First is the chemo attraction. The chemo attraction means that there is the attraction of the chemicals. There are some chemicals which are attracted, which are released through the stigma and are attracted the pollen grains. See what happens after the pollination. The pollen grains, they will land on the stigma, but only the compatible pollen grains, they will form the pollen tube. What do you mean by compatible pollen grains? See, there are some substances like water and sugar which are released by the stigma, and they are absorbed by the pollen grains which land on the stigma. If the pollen grains were compatible, means were of the same species, then only they will absorb the water and the sugar from the stigma. If they absorb the water and the sugar from the stigma, then they are known as the compatible pollen grains. After that, what happens? After the absorption of the water and sugar, the pollen grains swelled up, and the tube emerges through the germ pore in the form of pollen tube. See, generally in most of the flowering plants, what happens that the pollen that will land on the stigma, they are of two cell stage pollen grain. That is, that will constitutes the one is the generative cells and another is the vegetative cells. The vegetative cells will forms the pollen tube that will emerges from the pollen tube through the germ pore, and whereas the generative cells, it will forms the two male gametes. So when the pollen grain swells up, the tube emerges from the germ pore through the germ pore in the form of pollen tube, as you can see in the picture. In the first picture, there are two pollen grains land on the stigma. After absorbing, they were swelled up and they will form the pollen tube. But in the another picture, besides this, there is S1 pollen grains which are not compatible pollen grains. They do not forms the pollen tube because they are not able to absorb the water and the sugar, so they are not compatible. Clear? So they are not compatible. When generally there are only one pollen tube that is emerges, that condition is known as the monosiphonous conditions. And when there are more than one pollen tube, then that condition is known as polysiphonous conditions. So this is the chemo attraction of pollen and pistil. Pistil, you all know that this condition, this whole structure is known as the pistil. So chemo attraction means where there are various chemicals in the form of sugar and in the form of various sugars and water, they will release from the stigma. They were the pollen grain absorb that chemicals, and due to which they get swollen up, and the vegetative cell sorry, The vegetative cells, they will forms the pollen tube through which will emerges from the germ pore, and it will enters the stigma and and it enters the style. Fine. And when this is coming, when the pollen tube is there, then what happens? The generative cells, it will divide mitotically to forms the two male gametes. Fine. So next step is the generative cells will undergo mitotic divisions, producing the two male gametes. The next is, that is the movement of the pollen grain, movement of the male gametes, or the movement of the male gametes through the style. See, there are different types of style. There are two conditions: when the pollen tube is moving through the hollow style, or when the pollen tube is moving through the solid style. In the first case, when the in the first case when in the first case when this when the pollen tube, it will move through the hollow style. Hollow styles means it will surrounded by the parenchymatous, it will surrounded by the epidermis only, and there inside that there is a canal for the passage of the pollen tube, and which is lined by a specialized large cells. So in the hollow style, the pollen tube, it is very easy for the pollen tube to descend through the hollow style. Okay, but here are the various conditions. In the solid style, what happened? There is no such canal present in the solid style. They have a special conducting tissue which are lined by the parenchymatous tissues. Okay, these parenchymatous tissues, they are lined inside the solid style, and the pollen tube has to be descend through the breaking of this tissue. Okay, the pollen tube, it will move through the style by secreting the enzyme known as pectinase and hydrolytic enzymes. Okay, इसको तोड़ती हुई अंदर ब्रेक करती हुई अंदर जाएगी. This is the case of the solid style. Okay, and you know that, as I have already told you, that pollen tube, that contains the pollen tube that contains the two male gametes. अब जैसे जैसे वो solid cell में नीचे आती रहेगी, वैसे वैसे क्या होगा, अब पूरे वैसे वैसे क्या होगा कि वो स्क्वीज होती रहेगी. स्क्वीज होगी तो इसकी वजह से क्या हो सकता है, जो मेल गैमेट्स हैं, जो जनरेटिव सेल्स जो डिवाइड हुई थी टू मेल गैमेट्स में, वो गैमेट्स जो है ऊपर की तरफ जा सकते हैं. Say example is this. So to prevent the squeezing of the pollen tube and the gametes, there present a callose plug. पोलन ट्यूब में एक स्ट्रक्चर प्रेजेंट होता है जिसको हम बोलते हैं callose plug. That callose plug is formed to prevent the backflow of the content. Fine. Now, up the pollen tube is entering through the style, and it will enter the ovule. There are three conditions through which the pollen tube, they will enter into the ovule. The first is if the pollen tube, it will enter through the chalaza, then that condition is known as chalazogamy. Example is Casuarina. Fine. And when the pollen tube, it will enters through the integuments. These are the integuments. If the pollen tube enters through the integument, then that condition is known as mesogamy. Example is Cucurbita family. And the most widely seen type of entry of the pollen tube is through the micropyle, that is known as porogamy. This can be asked in for the 1 marks question, that is what is chalezogamy, what is mesogamy, and what is porogamy. Chalezogamy, as the name suggests, chaleza, when the pollen tube enters through the chaleza. Mesogamy, when the pollen tube enters through the integuments. And porogamy, pore means porogamy derived from the word pore. Pore means a hole. Hole is where you find that hole in the ovule, that is a small opening, that is a micropyle. So when the pollen tube enters through the micropyle, that is known as the porogamy. So with this we have completed the second step of the fertilization event, that is the movement through the style. Now, the process of fertilization. When the pollen tube can carrying the two ovules, they enter through the micropyle end, the synergids you all know that I have already discussed in the previous video about when I was discussing about the structure of the ovule, that the ovule consisting of that the synergids on the micropylar end and antipodals on the chaleza end, and in between there are the two polar nuclei. Those and the synergids, there are two synergids present at the micropylar end, and in the center of that present the oof, that is the egg. Okay, the synergids in the ovule, they will guide the pollen tube to कि कैसे enter करना है pollen tube के. Then the pollen tube, it will burst one of the synergids, and out of the two male gamete, one male gamete, it will fuse with the egg which is present in the center. दो साइड्स में सिनर्जिस होते हैं और बीच में क्या होता है, एग. तो एक जो मेल गैमेट है पोलन ट्यूब के अंदर, पोलन ट्यूब में दो मेल गैमेट्स होते हैं, एक मेल गैमेट जो है वो फ्यूज कर जाएगा एग के साथ. दैट प्रोसेस इज नोन एज सिनगैमी और द ट्रू फर्टिलाइजेशन. ठीक है, दैट विल प्रोड्यूसेस द डिप्लॉयड जाइगोट. ठीक है, नाउ that another nucleus, it will fuses with the two polar nuclei. जो ये सेंटर में जो polar nuclei हैं ये वाले, यहाँ पे ये जो है, ये जो second male gamete है, it will fuses with the polar nuclei forming the triple endosperm nucleus. Okay, clear है? This type of fertilization is called vegetative and also known as triple fusion. Triple fusion क्यों कहा? क्योंकि दो न्यूक्लियस ऑलरेडी हैं सेंटर में और उसके बाद एक मेल गैमेट आके फ्यूज कर जाएगा. तो there are three nucleus there. So that type of fertilization is known as vegetative fertilization or the triple fusion. That will forms the endosperm. So ठीक है, that will form the primary endosperm. ठीक है, प्राइमरी एंडोसोम क्या होता है, क्या फंक्शन है, we will discuss in the next video. Now, but this is most important thing, that is the double fertilization. What is double fertilization? The phenomena of the fusion of the two male gametes of the two different cell of the same female gametophyte to produce two different structure. That is known as double fertilization. See, this definition is very very important. Fusion of two male gametes to the two different cells. दो different cells में के साथ fuse हुए थे. एक से हुआ fuse किसके साथ? एक fuse हुआ था egg के साथ, दूसरा fuse हुआ polar nuclei के साथ. Of the same gametophyte. एक ही gametophyte है, single gametophyte में दो अलग अलग जगह पे अलग अलग सेल्स में फ्यूजन हो रहा है, जिससे कि दो अलग अलग स्ट्रक्चर्स प्रोड्यूस होंगे. जब वो एग के साथ फ्यूज हो रहा है, इट विल फॉर्म द जाइगोट, और जब वो पोलर न्यूक्लियस के साथ फ्यूज हो रहा है, इट विल फॉर्म द प्राइमरी एंडोस्पर्म. So okay, so this type of phenomena is known as double fertilization, and it is only found in the angiosperms, and it was first discovered by the Navastin in Lilium and Fritillaria. See, double fertilization, why double fertilization is absent in gymnosperm? Because they are devoid of ovaries and male and female gametophyte are present in the form of cones. whereas in angiosperm, gametophyte are the part of the flower. So what is its significance? That it will give rise to endosperm that will provide the nourishment and utilize the both male gametes. Clear? In this picture you can see that they are antipodals on the chalaza and ओके ये पूरे को एंटीपोडल्स कहेंगे. सेल्स को दो साइड्स की सिनर्जिड, सेंटर में है हमारा. these are antipodal cells, these are synergists. Center micropylar end पे there are the egg and center में polar nuclei. पोलन ट्यूब से आए दो न्यूक्लियस, एक न्यूक्लियस ने इसके साथ फ्यूज किया, ठीक है, और दूसरा न्यूक्लियस इसके साथ फ्यूज किया, तो इट विल फॉर्म, यहाँ पे बना जाइगोट, डिप्लॉइड, और यहाँ पे बना ट्रिप्लॉइड 3n, that is endosperm. Clear? So with this we have completed the fertilization and double fertilization. If you have any kind of doubt regarding the video or regarding the subjective matter, you can write in the comment below. And we will be soon posting the another video regarding the post fertilization events in the flowering plants. Thank you all.